In this tutorial video, we are going to take a look at the brand new Lite campaign V4.0. If you have watched the old tutorial video for Lite campaign V3.0, it might be worth watching this one anyway, because so many things have changed, especially the UI and the flow and so on, and you might want to give the campaign another shot. Because, let's be honest, Lite campaign V3.0 was not that playable just yet, while Lite campaign V4.0 is quite a bit closer to being that, and I hope many more people will be able to give it a shot, at least after watching this video. For that purpose, we are going to create a new campaign game right here. With the new game, you find your save games here, of course, and continuing the game just resumes the latest save. So we start a new game and set up our campaign. Could, of course, randomly generate a name for the company you're creating, and then just choose a country of origin. We do recommend that you choose either Helvetia or Gasmea for your first playthrough, because that gives you access to some of the most powerful markets, them being Gasmea, the main one, Helvetia having a big segment of premium and luxury cars, and Frenia, which is also starting out with a bit more of a sporty makeup, and that should give you a good range of cars to build. Achana and Delua are two options that are very interesting, but probably a little too hard for a start. We're not going to bother with the advanced setup here, but instead you can just choose your default difficulty and set that. If you want to have a more stress-free playthrough, you can always go into the advanced options and give yourself basically infinite money. That is the big money button right there, and that gives you $10 trillion. Once you have entered the campaign, you are dropped off on this screen. And before we go any further, let me describe what the actual gameplay loop of this is, what you're expected to do, and where this is all supposed to lead. You're starting your company in 1946, unless you change the settings to start a little later, and you're supposed to build up your company and make it a world-renowned manufacturer until 2020. And in order to do so, you're following a loop of designing a new car, putting it into engineering, setting up its production, then producing for a bit, making facelifts of that car, putting those into production, then maybe generating, or not generating, but designing a new car, and build that loop from scratch again and again and again for new models, and extending your range of models, expanding your factories, and then in the end you will end up at either a very successful or a very bankrupt company. With the amount of cash we have here, bankruptcy is not the biggest of our worries. What I'm not going to explain in this tutorial is how to build good cars, and there are plenty of sources out there that tell you, also our Discord and so on, but you can, if you're unsure, always start from a generated car. This is the same AI that generates the competitor cars, so at least you get something often quite useful. It's not the best you can build, but certainly usually pretty solid. So let's do that right now. We generate a car, and for that you need to pick a demographic that is available right at the start. They are colored according to their size. And if we want to fill our medium factories, which we have starting with this difficulty setting, then you probably want to pick something that has at least a greenish tint in it. And for that, we are going to pick, let's aim for family, or for premium. Yeah, let's aim for premium, have the car generated. And now let's take a look at what this AI did for us. It does look like it is somewhat competitive. What you're aiming for in the designer are numbers above 100, and preferably around 120 or higher, if you can muster that. That competitive number is what is displayed here as the first numeric field. The value below that is its affordability rating, which also is very important. Please take into account, though, that these numbers do change depending on what factory setup you put them into. If you are able to mass produce this vehicle, then of course it will be more affordable and also more competitive, because you can then choose to sell it at a lower price. On the other hand, if you are a boutique manufacturer who only has a tiny factory available, then best brace for a little bit of an impact that will be hitting your competitiveness and your affordability after you go through factory setup. Some other very important choices to take a look at are those in the chassis. And if you build the car from scratch, or if you have it generate, always check if this is what you actually want. Because depending on the materials you choose here, you are required to have a certain minimum factory size and certain add-ons for your factories. And those are usually not inexpensive things to build. If you go for panel material steel, that requires steel presses, and steel presses require a medium factory size. And a medium factory is quite expensive. We start with one here in this difficulty setting that is displayed on the starting screen when you set up your game. And that doesn't include the steel presses though, so you will have to pay for those. It's easy to pay for those with 10 trillion, but if you're choosing to start with less than that, then you should keep that in mind. So steel presses are required for steel panel material, and they would be required if we went for monocoque chassis, which isn't quite available yet. Ladder chassis don't require steel presses, so if you want to get around that and produce the car in a smaller factory, you could switch over to aluminium, which is handmade panels, and go with a ladder frame, which just needs to be welded together and doesn't require any kind of fancy add-ons. Also, this one has selected galvanized steel. Not really something you want if you want to get around factory add-ons. So steel is a lot easier. You can build the galvanization plant already on a small factory though. Another thing to consider, which is very important, is that you keep your engineering times at a reasonable level. Going double wishbone as the very first car that you create is only really something that I would recommend for very sporty cars or let's say luxury vehicles, and otherwise you might want to cheap out a bit. Remember that changes here that I just made probably impact the competitiveness of the car negatively, but what you need to keep in mind is that it being a lot easier to both engineer and manufacture will probably offset those negatives. The same thing is true for your engine. Engines cannot be produced in tiny factories anymore. That is now an engine contract, which doubles your material costs, and it has a pretty hefty price for the man-hours that it takes to produce this thing, which are your production units. So keep those in check. If you're engineering and producing the engine yourself, which is possible from a small or larger factory size that you either have or want to build, then yes, you will need add-ons, the Iron Foundry. That is something that has been changed for the Lite Campaign V4. All the same thoughts and kind of rules of thumbs do apply for the engine building, and that is try to keep your production units low and try to keep engineering time somewhat low as well. Don't forget to hover over your demographics in the side panel here and check what they actually want and what stats they want you to focus on. And what I just saw here, for instance, is that, well, the seat count or the seat range, it came spawned in with 5 seats. That's of course an option and would classify you as also a family car at the same time. We're currently a very good family sport premium vehicle, by the way. The seat range, very important, so double check on that if that is catering to what you want to build. And also, one handy thing that very few people seem to know about is that if you click these demographics, your car stats are being compared directly to the average stats of the top 3 competitors within that demographic. If you're playing on lower difficulty settings, that usually lowers your competitiveness setting, and that means that competitiveness of your competitors is lower than it should be. I think here we are at 70%, so even though you have lower stats in very, very many of these important statistics, stats here on the sides, you are still overall performing better than the average of the top 3. Better than the average of the top 3 means more than 100 points in competitiveness. When you're satisfied with your car, make sure to also come by the Markets tab or the Markets mode on the Testing tab of the car designer, just to check out if you're catering to the demographics that you want to cater to, which is pretty much the case right now, in this very example that is. One table that is often overlooked but very important is the one that is very last on the summary page. In this list you have the engineering time of the car, the production units, and the material costs. All 3 very important stats for the production and the sale of this car. And the engineering times are not linearly added, but a bit more in your favor, because all these sections are being worked on in parallel by your engineers. So the sum total of this is Not the longest time, but not that much longer than the longest time, because most of it can be done in parallel, not all. The production units is what is costing you in man-hours later on, and the material cost is how much you're paying per vehicle. Once you're all satisfied, just click the completed design button, and we are headed back to this screen, hopefully. This dropped you off right at the factory manager, but you want to get back to this screen and check out if you want to add any trims to your model. This is the model, and each model can have several trims. The more trims you have, the more complex it will be to set up your factories. Well, not really for you, but figuratively, and that will cost you more. Also, it will be harder to engineer for it. It will take longer and cost you more. But it allows you to cover more markets. So what we could be doing here is to create another trim. And of course, you don't have to just build it from scratch, but instead what you are supposed to be doing, if you want to have another one, and I think this is a reasonable time to do that, is you clone the existing trim. Now you have an exact copy of what you just built, and now you can go in there via the edit button and make changes to it. I've now renamed this trim to the luxury trim, and we are going to enter the luxury trim right there and try to make it slightly different. You don't want to have too much overlap between your trims, because that just steals market share away from each other. And what you instead want to be doing is to create a bit of a gap, something more like this here. You can retarget a different demographic, like I did there. Just target the trim demographic that you like, and you can unpin the other one if you don't want to see that anymore, although it can be quite handy to have that pinned as well, because then you see how far removed you now are from the other demographic that you have already catered to. And now I think I'm happy with this setup. I have 2 trims in my lineup for this model, and that should not be called the premium, but rather something fancy. So now that we have our fancy first car with a premium and luxury trim, we head over to the factory management. We do have our pre-built factory available, and that one is not ready for production just yet. We have to enter it and configure it for the production of our first car. And there is our little factory. It looks so small, but that is because you're so zoomed out. A medium factory is already reasonably large. And what we did not have just yet were steel presses. And once you have selected all the prerequisites for producing the car here, they are always flashing, and you can see them here in the production flags as well. And this is what is being added. Oh, yeah, that is expensive. 360 million. That hurts a little company a lot, unless you have 10 trillion in the bank. With this new version of the Lite campaign, we have added several factory add-ons. And they are not all available for all sizes, but for this one we have the QA testing, which reduces the slowdown that is produced by cars that are failing that test. And then we have the maintenance, which keeps your tooling nice and fresh, as well as the building. It lowers the wear in general for major tooling and the building, and that means lower costs over many, many years, but it takes a while to have that paid back entirely. 120 million, not necessarily cheap. Also, staff facilities are kind of training facilities for your staff, and that gives us straight to the new game mechanics, which are popping up right there very soon. And that is build quality, very important. On the next page, you can select what trims to produce in this factory. One thing to keep an eye on is these production flags. Here we have a limited production flags, which comes just from the luxury interior. It takes a long time to put that together, and that just slows down production. It is a bottleneck. A blue flag means limited production, a yellow flag means no mass production, and slows down the factory even more. The larger the factory and the more automated the factory, the worse these flags are. If you wanted to, for instance, make sure that the premium is being produced at a premium efficiency, you could do the following and just say that, no, we are not going to produce the luxury trim, which has some limited production flags, or you would probably not be doing this in this case, but let's say it has also a yellow flag on top of the blue one, then it would be worth a consideration to put this trim into a separate factory, because these two being together still is being slowed, like the premium is still being slowed down by the luxury trim, because that one is hampering the factory's efficiency. In order to do that, you would deactivate the trim here, build another factory, set that one up, and then only select that one for production while deactivating the other one. And on the next tab, we have just a summary of what your settings are at the moment, and a lot of controls that are all about build quality, QA, and factory condition. That is all new in this update. What you do need to consider is how fresh is your factory? Well, right now it's perfectly fresh. We have our minor tooling all the way at the bottom. That is what is trim specific. So if you make a new facelift, then this will need to be updated. If you're building a new model, then the major tooling will also have to be updated. And your factory building will have to be updated when it rains in, or when you choose. The automation level of your factory is a measure of how automated it is, how much staff you need. So if you pull this up, you have lower staff costs, and the cost per production unit that is being output will get lowered, but it does cost you a lot to set that up, as you can see there. And then we have tooling quality, which kind of does the same thing, but also has a significant effect on build quality. And while we are fiddling around with these sliders, let's take a look at this new, very important plot. These are Gaussian curves. That is your production quality spread. And the y-axis is the probability of producing a car at that certain quality, at this build quality. 100 means exactly to specifications, and that means it is reliable, it is just like written in the adverts, it's pretty much perfect. Anything beyond that has tighter tolerances and is even better than advertised. And anything below that can cause some issues, because sometimes that will net you recalls. And recalls are pretty nasty. They can cost you a lot, either monetarily or in reputation. You do see one vertical line here, which is the QA threshold. And the area under the graph, which is to the left of that, is what is slowing down your factories and is being stopped and fixed. So if you up the threshold, more and more cars will be taken off the line as they are discovered to be faulty, below your expectations, and that will create a lot of slowdown. In this case, it will slow the whole factory down in the first year by 43%. So that might not be the best option. On the other hand, maybe you don't want to have the potential recalls that are coming from that. Down below the slowdown percentage, you have the recall rate, and that is per month. So if you have this factory running, that's a tiny, tiny chance for a recall to happen, because your QA is quite tight. If you loosen that up a bit to some, let's say, reasonable levels, like 90%, 90% is good enough for the most part, right? That is 0.26% per month chance of there being a recall. Still slows you down by 33% though. So what you can do is up your production quality, or for instance, make your workers a little bit more efficient. And you can see how that all affects the build quality over the years. If we get into deterioration for the factory, these numbers will come down. If you're running the factory really hard at 3 shifts, the condition of the factory deteriorates quicker, and that means that your production quality will suffer. If you're working on 1 shift and keeping good track of your factory condition, then it is quite likely that your staff will learn a lot over the years and actually produce in year 5 more qualitatively better cars than what they did in the first year, even though their tooling is slightly worn at that point. Anyway, play around with these sliders, see what they do to the distribution of car quality, and see what that does for your recall and slowdown and so on. One last thing that should be stated is that the average build quality of your cars will also have an effect on your reputation and your company prestige. The higher it is, the better it is. And the higher your prestige and reputation is, the more desirable your cars are. I've now just clicked the confirm button in the factory on the last page where we just were, and we're back to the factory selection and the building. Well, we have cleaned that all up. This is now green and ready to sign off, and now we are going forward to the engineering. So it is setting up your cars as you like, setting up your production the way you want. Then we head over to the engineering settings of that car and find, most often, that it is taking way too long. These are realistic times though, and you now need to make some hard compromises. The tooling optimization we have over here is a tricky one to understand, so let me explain that. If you're wondering what this thing is, the title bars do have little hints in there which do explain it reasonably well. So, the tooling. Well, what that one does is engineer the car better for mass production, so that it is more capable to be mass produced. If you're trying to pull that all the way to the top and you have a tiny factory which has just manual labor, or for the most part manual labor, then that is not a good idea. And the thresholds for where that is, what value you want here, as opposed to your factory settings automation level, that very much depends also on the year you're in. The later you go, the more automated factories become. Like in year 2010, of course, factories want to be on average much more automated than in the year 1946. So I think a good starting point here in this case for our factory, we also want to save some time after all, is to go slightly more towards the manual side, about 40. Process is how wasteful you are with materials. So if you pull that up, it takes you longer to engineer, but you're going to save some material costs. As you can see there, all the way at the top, well, we've just saved $1,000 on materials, but on the other hand, we have a lot higher costs in engineering and also a bit more of a slowdown. Reliability is exactly what you would consider it to be, and that is the reliability of your car. The sum of all modifiers is shown in there. That does not affect the engine. The engine effect is separate, and this, of course, ups the engineering time significantly, but if you want to make a very reliable car company, then yeah, that might be a good idea to give that a little extra. Also, you need to very much consider what segment you're selling to. Premium and luxury car buyers usually don't quite as much care about reliability as those who are not able to pay big repair bills. And that means we can cheap out on that a little too. We have now arrived at 60 months worth of engineering time, which is a decent first car. That is 5 years. If you can, and you're building a somewhat simpler car as your first one, you can try to get this to around 50 months, which is around optimal, I would think. It very much depends on what you want to build though. And the more familiarity you get, the more often you build with certain components. The familiarity is shown in this column, and currently it is 0 because, well, we have not built any cars yet. The more familiarity you have, the more discounts you get on your engineering time. We also have 2 sliders that are still not being used, and the pressure slider makes your engineers work harder or dabble around more with some ideas and learn stuff. Learning, of course, is a luxury, and messing about as well, especially in the car industry. So let's put up the pressure a bit and the funding, because we have the money. Now our project is a little bit more costly. It also has a lower reliability because we downed that slider and put more pressure on them. They make more mistakes that way, of course. Yeah, not nice. But I think that will be worth it. 52 months, that is a lot of so-called opportunity cost that we have just eliminated. 8 months worth of engineering time means 8 months worth of sale and 8 months worth of your competitors not being able to release their latest release yet, their latest cars yet. And that means more profits for you. So it might be worth that despite the project being more costly and you having worse stats. Keep that in mind. Now when we think that we are all set up here, we do the exact same thing for the engine. In the engine project management, we see the automatically generated engine. We want to set up its factory, and I just fixed a little issue there, which we need to sort out. So now you can select the factory, and now we get into the project. Into the factory, we need the iron foundry. We have a medium 1 factory set up there, and we are going to produce this variant in it, correct, and we are going to do the exact same setup as we did for the car. For the engine, there are fewer production flags to consider, and usually the engine factories tend to be more efficient because of that. But other than that, mostly the same rules apply. Also for the build quality. If your engine fails in the car, then, yeah, well, you have to do a recall for the whole car. And there we go, a recall rate of 0.22%. It's not too much, and a slowdown rate of 24. Well, that hurts, but I think we have a good production going here. Number of variants being produced, and that is more than enough to cover all our car production. Now that the factory is all set up, we have green status there, nothing is blinking and being angry at us. So now let's do the engineering. And what we find here is that, well, the engineering time doesn't look too bad for this one. So thanks engineers that you have engineered something that is not too terrible for me. And now we can maybe give it even some more reliability or some better tooling. And maybe pull that one down a little. So 52 months was the other one, the car project. And one very important thing to notice here on this very last page of the factory, of the project setup for the engine, is the utilization of the factory versus how many are being requested. You are the blue line. If you head over the yellow line, that means your factories are overworked. And this looks like we are even oversized for production. If the car factory is running at 3 shifts, which is all the way here, then this factory will be running at 1.4 shifts roughly. So that is what this graph wants to tell you. Overall, we see that this project is going to cost you $212 million. And that might be a lot of money. So that is why you have financing options here, where the options are no loan, we can cover just the plot costs, but we own the plot, so that would be 0. And we have the factory cost, the building cost itself, and that is, of course, with the add-on that has been built for this one, and that is a lot of money already, 200. And then we can add on the engineering costs, and we can add on, please don't start paying back the loan until the car enters production. And then, of course, you have some options for the length, duration of the payback window, and you can request a little bit more as long as this remains green. And now, before we sign off this engine project and make it ready to be used by the car once it is ready, we take a look at what this engine costs in total. Per engine, we have a cost that is estimated to be $2,060. These $2,060 do include a projection of costs over 5 years to pay back some of our investment. And that includes all these 4 branches, where this one at the moment, disregard that shouldn't be 0. That's our loans, because we have set up a loan here. You can exclude the factory building costs. That makes the engine cheaper. You can exclude the tooling costs. Well, that makes the engine a lot cheaper. And you can exclude the engineering costs, which also makes the engine slightly cheaper by $30. But that means that when you sell a car, that car needs to somehow, in different ways, include that kind of payback that you want from here. This is just a tool for you to sell to yourself an engine to your car, so that the car knows, okay, we need to have this engine at a price of $2,060 in order to pay back for the additional efforts we have put in here for the creation of this project. If you want to keep the car as cheap as possible and go from there, and yeah, we're basically losing money on it, you can deactivate these manually. For now, we're going to keep them toggled on, and we are now pretty safe in assuming that over 5 years, if our cars are selling well, this engine will pay itself and its factory within 5 years. So the engine now has a green tick in there, and we are heading forward to the forecasting tool. The first thing we want to set up here is the minimum shifts, the target shifts, and the maximum shifts of the car factory. The engine factory doesn't have that setting because it is working on demand. The higher the shift count we are working at, the more deterioration from the factory we get, but also we do want to set this up so that it doesn't cost a fortune to produce, because the last shift, when you go between 2 and 3 shifts, that adds a lot of cost in the production. So if you want to stay efficient, try to stay below 2 shifts or right at 2 shifts. The last shift costs double the amount because it's the night shift, and who wants to work at the night shift? Now that we have changed that, you can also see how these trims are expected to be performing in future. And this is the first year of production, so that is not quite 5 years in the future, like 4 to 5 years in the future, when the car is being released and the first year of production. And it is expected to have a competitiveness rating of 151 and 181 for the luxury. That is quite impressive, of course, and this should mean that it sells well. We see that over the years it's going to get weaker and weaker, and for a premium-ish brand, we are probably going to do a facelift after about 3 years. This is the margin settings for this car, and because we are considering to put on a margin anyway, automatically with these buttons once again, that is the exact same mechanic as for the engine, but here it's only considering car things. The factory costs? Is this included is this put on top of our base price to produce the car so that it pays back itself in year number 5? Well, yes, if we want to have that margin added on top, then it will appear in the price. And the same thing we did here for the tooling cost and the engineering costs. And if you want to just make the car as cheap as possible, once again, you can toggle these off and you see that the price here really drops. But that also means that you are probably having a harder time to turn a profit unless you add manually some margin here onto the sales price. You do have 3 important columns here. Factory utilization, that is in shifts. If this is a high value, then you're doing well. And we have the yearly profit loss and the cumulative profit loss. And of course, green numbers are nice, and we see that we have targeted year 5 as a break-even point. This is basically what that means. And we are indeed, at the end of year 5, supposed to break even, despite us building some pretty hefty buildings there, which are a future investment. And that is all looking good. So this is a very healthy setup, it seems. And I don't think we need to add additional margin. We could, of course, in 5% increments, make these a bit cheaper or more expensive. And I think what I'm going to do here is add a bit on the luxury one, because we don't want to have too much overlap between these two. That, of course, has changed the forecast, and it doesn't look as rosy anymore, but I'm now going to say that is fine. And you might disagree, which is fine. Now we're heading off to the very final page of the setup for this project, and we see the overall summary. This is the one factory we are using to produce these 2 trims in, and we are seeing that we are probably going to produce 974, or we could produce, if demanded, we could produce 974 of the premium and 778 of the luxury, and that is within a month. Keep an eye on the pre-production bar chart. You probably want to keep the engineering times about the same unless you have a specific setup in mind. And if they are not the same, you can make the lower one as high as the other one, because that means they are finishing at the same time. The tooling time or build time for the factory is the other 2 bars, and for very large factories, that one might be larger than the engineering time. Again, we have the option to take out a loan for the car and its costs, and let's do that. These loans, by the way, are not being paid out into your account, but rather they are automatically cancelling out the payments that are made for this project. So instead of seeing a big lump sum in your account being added there, what you're seeing is nothing. It looks like the loan has not been given, but also, weirdly enough, you're not paying anything for your factory. So yes, it is all working. And once you're happy with your setup, we just click to complete this design, and now we are on the project sign-off screen. On this sign-off screen, and it's very handy, you can do some complex stuff with this one. You can align projects. Because we have aligned it manually, this alignment number is +0 at the moment. They are both selected to be signed off together. In order to sign off a car, you need to have signed off its engine, or do that at the same time. So for this one, we are just going to sign off both of them at the same time, and this is looking fabulous, or rather fancy, and we can sign off the selected projects to have both of them go into engineering. Engineering, you see right there, this is now the hub that we are in. You see that they are engineering right there. It's a yellow colored bar for your first car, the fancy one even, and a premium luxury trim are part of that one. You can collapse or expand this one. Down here you see your factories, and because we have increased the tooling quality, some of these hit points will need to regenerate. And we also do have the factory retooling being listed down here in the Gantt chart, and they're all scheduled to be done in May of 1950. Now we can't do all that much apart from wait, so let's put it to a larger multiplier up here and head forwards. You can see that our company now has expenses that is $623,000 per month. That doesn't even make a dent in our comfortable cushion of Fed money. Now we see that the car factory 1 is also taking a bit of money, or rather most of the pie, and now you shall see that the engine factory will do the same thing, and there our expenses look a lot more diverse, but that is not necessarily a good thing in this case. And there we go. Our car has just started selling, and now we have most of our costs be car production and engine production and loan repayments, while our revenue is coming from our fancy first car. That's all looking good. So now you need to consider the following. We are still in the gameplay loop of not just looking at what is going to happen, but rather acting way in advance and predicting what's going to happen, and that makes for good businessmen, right? So we need to look ahead and already plan for our facelift. Or why not make a facelift of this car? Because sooner or later, this design is already 5 years old, remember? And we need to update that ASAP, because new stuff has come out and people want the latest radio technology. In order to create a facelift, we just go into the car projects. We see that this car currently is in production, that's the light blue here. And we go and edit the project. And here we see our current 2 trims, and they are indeed performing well. We are better than the competition by quite a bit, despite our increased margin. And now, if we want to make a facelift, we just start a new car facelift right here. And you see that both of these trims are now blinking red. They want to be re-edited, because they are just now copies of the old one. And that is because we have activated them. That is the default setting. That is that the old trim is carried over and is being updated, is being refreshed. So what you do then is to go into the trim and edit it, make the changes you want, update the technology you need to. For instance, we could put in an automatic gearbox. Doesn't that sound fancy? Well, they love it. One thing that is really handy and very commonly overlooked is that there is a bit of a help mode in here for you to see what you have been building before and where you have familiarity. If you toggle on the company part familiarity, you see what parts are colored a little differently. You see here, yes, that's orange. We know about it a little bit. We have a familiarity rating of almost 8% in manual gearboxes. And that means that you're going to pay 8% less engineering time than you would if you were a noob at designing those, as we were just before making this one. Now that I've updated my premium replacement and have a lot higher score here, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the luxury. And with these numbers, I think our outlook is very solid. Now, do the exact same thing again. We activate our factory, the one that is in production at the moment. And we see there is a little bit of wear on this one, but it doesn't need major changes. I'm going to deactivate the factory building and also the major tooling. I don't think we just need to update that yet. But of course, we have no choice in updating or not updating the minor tooling, because it needs to be updated, because the trims did change. You can only update the automation level or the tooling quality if you also at the same time update the major tooling. Now the process is just as it was before. We go through to engineering, see that it is taking a base time of 28 months, and that is mostly because I added some advanced 50s safety. And this shows you also why you need to be on top of things with facelifts, because this is going to take another 32 months. And during that time, your factory can produce, and your cars can be sold into the markets. You can also choose to revamp your engine, and that would be done in a very similar way. And that is, if you go in here, I probably should also show that. When you're editing the trim, you can go in here to your engine and you have both of these locked, but what you can do is replace an existing variant. And if we wanted to do that, we can select this one. It automatically creates a facelift for us. It drops you in here and this is the engine that is in the car, and you can update it the way you want. And once you have set up everything, just exit out and make sure that the other trim is also using just that one. And it is, automatically, because it was set to replace that variant of the engine, and it warned you about, on the selection page there, that will include this very trim. And that means that we just need to re-enter here quickly, make sure that everything is still in order, and then we go forwards with the project. So once that is done, everything is back in the green here, and the engineering hasn't changed there. But now for the engine, we also need to set up the factory. I don't think it requires any changes and has still very nice condition, of course, because we have only run production for 2 months, so that is not necessarily a surprise. We can further improve the tooling process and the reliability of the engine while lowering the pressure more. And we see that if we want to go to 32 months here, that gives us quite a reliable engine. Our engineers now have plenty of time and we don't even have to spend that much money. And what you see here is that the price, after it has been paid back over the previous 5 years, which won't be 5 years in total, so you need to keep that in mind, is that the price has come down a lot. $1,400 for this one. Well, if the other one had paid back everything, which isn't the case at the moment. But yes, the retooling of the factory and a slight update usually is a lot cheaper than making an entirely new one. Now that the engine factory is all green and the project as well, that is all signed up, and we can again check our settings for the car production, make sure that your margins are the way you want, and we see that the overall cost of producing this car has come down a lot. And that is because that also, just for the engine, assumes that you have paid back the initial costs that were part of the project, like the major tooling and so on. So you might want to put a bit of extra margin on top of here, because otherwise that might nip you in the butt. And that looks a lot more solid. Now we see that the factory retooling will only take 4 and 3 months, and that is something we want to remember for something that we're going to do right after signing this one off. And the sign-off screen is what is coming next, so we just sign these off, and now we have our facelift in engineering, and factory production will continue as normally until we go into retooling. And for the retooling, we just need to keep in mind that that takes 4 months, as you also see with the start and end date here. And 4 months, we want to have, for 4 months, we want to have stock. Currently, the stock is set to be at 6 months. That is very good. We could also up it to have some more stock, 9 or 12 months, but that is a bit of overkill for such a simple retool. This is a very important setting if you want to make sure that you have continuous sales while your factories are down. The AI will automatically try to achieve a production level that will net you a certain amount of stock that you can set here at the end of this section. It is not perfect, however, so you might want to fiddle around with the target a bit, maybe make it more generous. Now we have covered the entire loop of building a car and putting it into production and engineering it, but there's of course more around that also needs to be taken care of. Especially on the harder difficulties, it is vital for you to, already before you actually start engineering this one, take into consideration that you will need some dealerships to actually sell your cars. With the easier difficulty settings, those are already being set up for you, so we don't need to worry as much. We do have a pretty high dealership level in the country we are starting in, and we do have some smaller dealership networks in the countries we have access to. What dealership networks do is allow you access to the markets. Without the dealerships, you can't sell a single car. And dealership levels do cost you quite a bit. If you are starting on a harder difficulty setting, you don't get any for free, and you need to up those to be built and slowly increase over time until you sell your first car. So just make sure that if you're playing on insane difficulty, remember to actually up the target way before your car actually launches. What the dealership level does is to give you a minimum awareness and a maximum soft threshold awareness. Your awareness will vary with how much marketing you're doing and how well your cars are performing, how competitive your cars are. The more competitive your car is, the more general awareness it will get for free, and marketing can push that further. Marketing does work according to stats, and that means that if you're marketing towards drivability, then all demographics that value drivability to a certain extent will see this marketing to that extent. So if you are having a demographic there which values drivability at, let's say, 20%, which is very high, then they will see a lot of the drivability marketing, while a demographic that only cares about drivability to 5% of their total score, that sees a lot less of that effect. That will also increase awareness in those demographics specifically. You can not only market towards the major stats, and that is by country, mind you, but you also can market towards company prestige and reputation. These are also region-specific, and they just in general give you a buff to your desirability, the car's desirability that you're producing. And depending on what the demographics want, if they are looking for more reputation or prestige, that will affect them differently. Buyers that are on the lower end of the price spectrum, they tend to value your company reputation a bit more. That is what is tied to your reliability, the car's reliability, while the higher end buyers will of course look at your company prestige level quite a bit more. Marketing and dealerships are roughly on the same level of importance. So while you might not want to put the same amount of money into those, it is advisable to not neglect one or the other. In the World Markets and Trends page, which you can access either via this button or via this button up here, open and close, that page is very powerful. You can access all kinds of data from here. And also, for instance, you can limit it to your awareness or not. If you want to know what your current awareness is, you see that easily right there. In Helvetia at the moment, you can see that we are at 7, which is our current minimum because we have that dealership level of 4 in there, which gives you a minimum awareness of 7 in all demographics. But also you can see that we already have a little bit of more awareness in some of the demographics that we are selling to. And that is because we have a very competitive trim in these markets. If you click on competitiveness, you see a company overview of how competitive your trims are in the available demographics. This is very handy to see where your company is and where it isn't, and how well it is performing. If you hover over these, you also not only see what your company is scoring, or the best trim of your company is scoring in that demographic, but also you see an overview of your best competitors. And that can give you a good hint as to what sales prices they're going for in those demographics. Here, for instance, we are currently selling it at $18,300, while they are charging on average $24,400. Speaking of that, in Lite Campaign 4.0 you don't have access to any manual manipulation of sales prices just yet, beyond the setup we've gone through. That will be coming in Lite Campaign V4.1. Important for your long-term success is also research and development. And because we started on a very easy setting, you do have a base level of technology that is higher than common knowledge. 2 years to be exact. And you can manually increase the level of research that is being done and is being conducted by upping the individual categories. And you're going to see the green bar increasing from the distance increasing from the red bar, which is current date. And we currently have our unlocking tech that is covered by the green bar. And if we want to research something, that will take some time to get there. If we set it to +6, that is meaning that it's targeting being 6 years ahead of common knowledge, being 6 years ahead of this red line in that category. And we are now seeing that we have just become profitable, and that will probably just keep rising. And that didn't last long. What we can look at is the company finances at this point, and you're going to see your revenue, which is split up into your various models. Here we only have one, so that is just a little bit of a boring graph, but it shows on average the trend is upwards, which is good. And also you do see your current loans and how much you still need to pay back. In the expenses tab, often things look a bit more interesting, and here you see the split between your various outgoing costs. I think with all that being said, you should have seen all the basics of what is going on in the Automation Lite Campaign V4.0, and hopefully have a bit of a crutch for your first tries that you try yourself. The automation community is very helpful, and we do have a Discord, and that has a campaign channel too, where you can post about your exploits as well as ask questions to some of the experienced players. And I hope you enjoyed this little overview and give the Lite Campaign V4.0 a chance.